So this was one of my favorite fractions lessons because it was so interactive. So while I was reading The Lion's Share by Matthew McElligott, my students cut pieces of paper the size of what each animal took. So the elephant was the first one to take a piece of cake, so they cut the piece in half, then labeled the elephant's piece with an E. Then with the leftover piece, they cut it again for the hippo, and then again and again and again and again. It was really interactive, and it really helped to showcase my students that fractions are a part of a whole. And specifically, it helped to showcase that even though pieces come from the same whole, that does not mean that they are always going to have that same denominator. So I challenge my students to come up with each of the fractions for what the animals had taken. So the first one and the second one were relatively easy. Students knew pretty much right away that the elephant took half and the hippo took a quarter. But then after that, we went through how it doesn't just go from 1/2 to 1/4 to 1/6, like they seem to think. My students used the pieces they cut as a sort of manipulative. They were able to use a sheet of paper that was not cut and put those pieces back in to see what the denominator should be. So for the gorilla, they could do it and see that it fit into that piece, into the regular cake 8 times. So that is what the denominator would be. But then I challenged them to look at the ant's piece, which was super tiny, and I asked them, hey, is this going to be easy to put that in the piece of paper a bunch of times? And they all agreed not to. So instead, I showed them a different strategy, which was instead to double the denominator of the previous one taken. So for example, the tortoise would be double the denominator of the gorilla. So what's 8 times 2? 16. And I explained that the numerator would always be 1 because it's just one piece. And here's a student's work of how they did that. I ended up doing the first few with them, and then students really had to challenge themselves for this side and really had to take the time to do the work. So here is a student example. Once they were done, they had to do an exit slip in which they had to answer these 4 main questions. First one was each piece taken equal or the same? Why? The student said the pieces, it wasn't the same because it was getting smaller, which is true. Then what happens to the denominator as more halves are taken? It gets bigger. Who had the bigger piece, the tortoise or the warthog? Explain using their fractions. So if we look back, the tortoise had 1/16 and the warthog had 1/32. So the student said that the tortoise had the bigger piece, which is true. However, they did not explain using their fractions, and I did leave a note for them. Then when the ant halves her piece, what would the fraction that represents the lion's share of the cake be? And this is the correct answer, because when the ant halves her piece, there's only a tiny half left. It was exactly a half left. You'll see that my students' answers are pretty much the same for this one. Here's another student's example. And then here's a little bit of different answers for the exit slip. Was each piece taken equal or the same? No, because the lion has almost no cake, but the elephant has a lot. What happens to the denominator as more halves are taken? It gets bigger. Who had the bigger piece, the tortoise or the warthog? Explain using their fractions. The tortoise, because the tortoise had 1/16 and the warthog has 1/32. See, the student did incorporate the fractions, which was great. And then the same answer, when the ant halves her piece, the lion is going to have the same amount, 1 out of 512. This was a really great lesson that really taught my students about fractions being a part of a whole, and I would definitely love to incorporate it again into the future.